The radio crackled with desperate voices as mortar rounds whistled overhead. 22-year-old Sarah Martinez pressed herself against the concrete wall, her medical bag clutched against her chest like armor that could somehow protect her heart from what was coming. She had been a combat medic for exactly 4 months and 3 days. In 30 seconds, she would make a decision that would either save 12 lives or cost her everything she had ever believed about herself. This is not a story about war. This is a story about the moment when ordinary people discover they are capable of extraordinary things. This is about a young woman who went to war with a stethoscope and came home with the kind of courage that legends are made of. But before she became the medic who would be remembered in military history books, before the medals and the speeches and the tears of gratitude from families she would never meet, Sarah Martinez was just a kid from Phoenix, Arizona, who thought she knew what bravery looked like. She was wrong about everything, and that mistake would save more lives than any textbook ever could. Sarah Martinez had never intended to join the military. Growing up in a small neighborhood in Phoenix, she spent her afternoons at the local community center, helping elderly residents with their medication reminders and basic health checks. Her grandmother, Rosa, had diabetes, and Sarah learned to check blood sugar levels and administer insulin when she was just 14 years old. The responsibility felt natural to her, like breathing. When her high school guidance counselor suggested she consider nursing school, Sarah laughed. Her family could barely afford rent, let alone college tuition. Her father worked double shifts at a manufacturing plant, and her mother cleaned offices downtown. They were good people who worked hard, but money was always tight. The idea of spending 4 years in school while accumulating debt seemed impossible. Then Staff Sergeant Williams visited her high school during career day. He was a medic himself, weathered and serious, with stories that made the teenagers lean forward in their seats. He talked about serving his country while learning skills that would last a lifetime. He mentioned the education benefits, the medical training that rivaled any civilian program, and the chance to make a real difference in people's lives. After his presentation, Sarah approached him with questions that tumbled out faster than she could organize them. What was the training like? How long was the commitment? Could she really become qualified to save lives? Staff Sergeant Williams studied her carefully before answering. He saw something in her earnest questions and steady gaze that reminded him of himself 20 years earlier. 3 months after graduation, Sarah was on a bus to Fort Sam Houston in San Antonio, Texas, beginning her journey as a combat medic trainee. The transition from civilian life to military structure hit her like a physical blow. The early morning wake-ups, the precise ways of making beds and arranging lockers, the constant attention to detail in everything from uniform appearance to the way she addressed her instructors. But it was the medical training that truly challenged her. Sarah discovered that wanting to help people and actually having the skills to save, their lives were two completely different things. She spent hours memorizing anatomy, practicing 4 insertions on training dummies, and learning to perform medical procedures under pressure that would make experienced nurses sweat. Her instructor, Sergeant First Class Thompson, was particularly demanding. During one training exercise, he simulated a mass casualty event using actors with realistic wounds and makeup. As Sarah worked on a patient with a simulated chest wound, Sergeant Thompson stood behind her shouting contradictory orders and banging metal objects together to simulate the chaos of combat. "Martinez, your patient is bleeding out. What's your priority?" he yelled over the noise. Sarah's hands shook as she tried to apply pressure to the wound while simultaneously checking for other injuries. "Airway, breathing, circulation," she recited, but her voice lacked confidence. "I can't hear you. Your patient can't hear you. Everyone in this scenario is depending on you, and you're whispering like you're in a library." The criticism stung, but it also motivated her. Sarah began staying after hours in the training facility, practicing procedures until her movements became automatic. She studied medical texts late into the night, using a small flashlight under her blanket after lights out so she wouldn't disturb her roommate. During live tissue training, where medics learned procedures on anesthetized animals under veterinary supervision, Sarah initially struggled with the emotional weight of the exercise, but she understood its necessity. In combat, she would need to perform these same procedures on real people whose lives depended on her competence. One particularly challenging day involved a scenario where Sarah had to treat multiple casualties simultaneously while her instructors created increasingly chaotic conditions. Smoke machines filled the training area, speakers blared recordings of gunfire and explosions, and actors played panicking civilians and wounded soldiers calling for help. Sarah found herself overwhelmed by the sensory assault and the pressure of making rapid medical decisions. She froze for several seconds, staring at the scene before her, unsure where to start. Sergeant Thompson appeared at her shoulder. "Martinez, in combat, hesitation kills. What do you see?" Sarah forced herself to focus, blocking out the noise and confusion. She began to systematically assess each casualty, making quick decisions about treatment priorities. A soldier with a severe leg wound but stable vital signs could wait. A casualty with compromised breathing needed immediate attention. Another with signs of shock required rapid fore access. As she worked through the scenario, something shifted in her approach. The chaos around her began to feel less overwhelming and more like background information she could process without being paralyzed by it. She started communicating clearly with other medics in the exercise, coordinating care and ensuring no casualty was overlooked. When the exercise ended, Sergeant Thompson pulled her aside. "That's more like it, Martinez. You found your focus out there? But remember, this is just training. The real thing will test everything you think you know about yourself." Sarah's advanced individual training included weapons proficiency, field survival skills, and combat tactics. As a medic, she would carry a weapon, but her primary role was saving lives, not taking them. However, she needed to be capable of defending herself and her patients in combat situations. The contradiction troubled her initially. During weapons training, she struggled with the idea that the same hands she used to heal might need to harm. Her marksmanship scores were adequate but not exceptional, and her instructors noted her hesitation during combat simulation exercises. "Martinez," Sergeant Thompson said after a particularly difficult training day, "being a combat medic means accepting paradoxes. You carry tools of healing and weapons of war. You must be gentle enough to comfort a dying soldier and tough enough to function under enemy fire. It's not easy, but it's necessary." As her training progressed, Sarah began to understand the complexity of her role. She learned that combat medics throughout history had navigated these same contradictions, finding ways to maintain their humanity while performing their duties in the most inhumane circumstances imaginable. Her physical fitness improved dramatically during training. The young woman who had struggled to run a mile in high school could now complete obstacle courses while carrying a full medical kit and simulated casualties. Her confidence grew with her competence, but she remained humble about how much she still didn't know. During the final weeks of training, Sarah received word that her unit would be deploying to Afghanistan within 6 months of graduation. The news made her training feel suddenly urgent and real. Everything she was learning would soon be tested in actual combat conditions, with real lives hanging in the balance. Her family visited for her graduation ceremony. Her parents looked proud but worried as they watched her receive her combat medic badge. Her grandmother Rosa, now using a wheelchair but still sharp as ever, pulled Sarah aside for a private conversation. "Mia," Rosa said, taking Sarah's hands in her weathered ones, "you have the gift of healing hands. I saw it when you were little, helping me with my medicines. But now you're going to see things that will test your spirit. Remember who you are? Remember that every person you help has a family who loves them, just like we love you." Sarah hugged her grandmother tightly, feeling the weight of the responsibility she had chosen to accept. She thought she understood what lay ahead, but she had no way of knowing that her first real test as a combat medic would come sooner than anyone expected, under circumstances that would challenge every assumption she had made about courage, sacrifice, and what it truly meant to save a life. As she packed her gear for deployment, Sarah included a small photo of her family and a medal of St. Luke, patron saint of physicians, that her grandmother had given her. She had no way of knowing that in a few short months, She would find herself in a situation where all her training, all her preparation, and all her good intentions would seem completely inadequate for what war would demand of her. The helicopter touched down at forward operating base, courage in a cloud of dust and rotor wash that stung Sarah's eyes and filled her mouth with grit. Afghanistan looked nothing like the training videos she had watched back at Fort Sam Houston. The landscape stretched endlessly in shades of brown and gray, broken only by the occasional cluster of mud brick buildings that seemed to grow from the earth itself. Sarah stepped off the helicopter with 12 other soldiers, all new arrivals trying to look confident while secretly wondering if they were prepared for what lay ahead. The heat hit her like a physical blow, even though it was only 8 in the morning. By afternoon, temperatures would soar past 120 degrees. Staff Sergeant Rodriguez, a compact man with intense dark eyes and a scar running from his left ear to his jaw, greeted the new arrivals. He had been in country for 18 months and carried himself with the easy confidence of someone who had learned to survive in a place where survival required constant vigilance. "Welcome to the sandbox," he said, his voice carrying a mix of humor and warning. "Some of you will love it here. Some of you will hate every minute of it. All of you will be changed by it. Martinez, you're with me. You'll be working with Alpha Company, 3rd Platoon." The base was larger than Sarah had expected, with blast walls, guard towers, and prefabricated buildings arranged in a maze of military efficiency. Soldiers moved purposefully between structures, their weapons always close at hand, their eyes constantly scanning their surroundings. Sarah noticed that, even in the relative safety of the base, everyone maintained a level of alertness that she had never experienced during training. Her living quarters were a small room in a concrete building that housed 6 other soldiers. Each person had a narrow bed, a wall locker, and just enough personal space to feel human. Sarah unpacked carefully, placing her grandmother's photo on the small shelf next to her bed and hanging her stethoscope on a hook she fashioned from bent wire. Her roommate, Specialist Johnson, had been at the base for 8 months and served as an informal guide for new arrivals. Johnson was from rural Montana and had joined the army to see the world, though she often joked that Afghanistan was not exactly what she had in mind. "The thing about this place," Johnson explained as Sarah organized her gear, "is that you can't let your guard down, ever. Not on base, not on patrol, not when you're sleeping. The enemy doesn't wear uniforms, doesn't follow rules, and doesn't care about Geneva Convention protections for medics." Sarah felt a chill despite the oppressive heat. During training, she had learned that medics were supposed to be protected non-combatants, marked with red crosses to indicate their humanitarian role. Johnson's words suggested that such protections might be theoretical rather than practical in this environment. Her first week at the base was spent learning local procedures, understanding the layout of the surrounding area, and meeting the soldiers she would be responsible for keeping alive. Alpha Company consisted of 38 infantry soldiers, 2 medics including Sarah, and a handful of support personnel. The other medic, Corporal Davis, had been with the unit for 14 months and had seen more combat than Sarah could imagine. Davis was a quiet man from Oregon who spoke softly but commanded immediate attention whenever he offered medical advice. He had dark circles under his eyes and a slight tremor in his hands that Sarah noticed during their first meeting. She would later learn that Davis was suffering from what military doctors euphemistically called combat stress, though he refused to seek treatment for fear of being removed from his unit. "Out here," Davis told her during their first medical briefing, "you'll see injuries that don't exist in textbooks. Improvised explosive devices create wound patterns that are unpredictable and often devastating. You'll have to make decisions about who can be saved and who can't, and you'll have to make them fast, under fire, with incomplete information." Sarah's first patrol came during her second week at the base. Alpha Company was tasked with conducting a presence patrol through a nearby village, gathering intelligence and demonstrating coalition forces' ability to operate in the area. Sarah checked and rechecked her medical supplies, ensuring she had everything needed to treat common battlefield injuries. The patrol departed the base before dawn, moving through the desert landscape in armored vehicles that provided protection but also limited visibility and mobility. Sarah rode in the third vehicle, positioned to respond quickly to any casualties while remaining relatively protected from initial contact with enemy forces. The village they visited seemed almost abandoned, with only a few elderly residents visible on the streets. Children peered at them from doorways and around corners, their expressions mixing curiosity with wariness. Sarah noticed that most of the military-age men were absent, which the patrol leader noted as potentially significant intelligence. During their stop at the village medical clinic, Sarah got her first glimpse of the medical challenges facing local civilians. The clinic was a single room with basic supplies and no electricity. The local doctor, an elderly man who spoke limited English, showed her patients suffering from conditions that would be easily treatable in American hospitals but were life-threatening in this environment. Sarah found herself wishing she could do more to help, but the mission parameters were clear. They were there to gather intelligence and demonstrate presence, not to provide medical care to local civilians. The contradiction between her instinct to help and her military mission created an internal tension that would grow stronger with each subsequent patrol. The return to base was uneventful, but Sarah noticed how differently the experienced soldiers behaved once they were back inside the wire. The relaxation was subtle but noticeable, shoulders dropped slightly. Scanning patterns became less intense, and conversations resumed normal volume. It was her first real understanding of the constant stress that defined life in a combat zone. Her third week brought her first real medical emergency. Sergeant Mitchell, a squad leader with 2 combat tours under his belt, collapsed during physical training. Sarah responded immediately, finding him unconscious and barely breathing. His skin was flushed and hot to the touch, classic signs of heat exhaustion progressing toward heat stroke. Sarah worked quickly to cool his body temperature while establishing 4 access to replace lost fluids. Other soldiers formed a protective circle around them, demonstrating the automatic defensive postures that combat experience had drilled into them. Within minutes, she had stabilized Mitchell enough for transportation to the base medical facility. Later, after Mitchell had recovered fully, he sought her out to express his gratitude. "Martinez," he said, "you saved my life today. I know it wasn't enemy fire or an IED, but heat can kill you just as dead as a bullet. You did good work out there." The acknowledgement from an experienced combat soldier meant more to Sarah than any training award she had received. It was her first confirmation that her skills could make a real difference in preserving life, even in routine situations. As her first month in country concluded, Sarah began to understand the rhythm of combat deployment. There were periods of routine activity punctuated by moments of intense excitement or danger. Soldiers developed coping mechanisms to deal with the constant uncertainty, from elaborate practical jokes to serious discussions about home and family. She also began to notice the toll that extended combat exposure was taking on her fellow soldiers. Sleep patterns were disrupted by regular mortar attacks that forced everyone into protective bunkers. Nerves frayed under the constant stress of never knowing when violence might erupt. Some soldiers became increasingly aggressive, while others withdrew into themselves. Sarah found herself serving as an informal counselor as well as a medic. Soldiers would visit her with minor medical complaints that were really excuses to talk through fears, frustrations, or concerns about family back home. She learned to listen carefully, understanding that her role extended beyond treating physical injuries to helping maintain the unit's psychological resilience. During her 5th week, intelligence reports indicated increased enemy activity in their area of operations. Patrols became more frequent and more dangerous. Sarah noticed that the experienced soldiers were taking additional precautions, double-checking equipment and spending extra time studying maps and intelligence briefings. Corporal Davis pulled her aside for a private conversation. "Martinez, things are about to get more serious around here. The enemy is planning something big, and we're going to be in the middle of it. I need you to understand that when the shooting starts, everything changes. All your training, all your preparation. It all comes down to split-second decisions under the worst possible circumstances. Sarah nodded, but she had no way of truly understanding what Davis was trying to prepare her for. She thought she was ready for combat. She had trained extensively, studied battlefield medicine, and successfully treated her first emergency. But nothing in her experience had prepared her for the reality that was approaching. When 12 lives would depend on her ability to function effectively while surrounded by enemies determined to kill her and everyone she was sworn to protect. The mission briefing began at 0400 hours on what would become the longest day of Sarah's life. Lieutenant Patterson, Alpha Company's commanding officer, stood before a detailed map of the surrounding area, his finger tracing route lines that seemed simple on paper but would prove treacherous in reality. "Gentlemen, ladies," Patterson began, his voice carrying the weight of command, "we have solid intelligence indicating that a high-value target is operating out of a compound, approximately 12 kilometers northeast of our position. Our mission is to conduct a clearing operation, gather intelligence, and neutralize any hostile forces we encounter." Sarah listened carefully as Patterson outlined the tactical plan. Alpha Company would approach the target compound in 3 squads, with Sarah positioned with 2nd Squad to provide medical support to the entire unit. The compound was isolated, surrounded by open terrain that would provide little cover if they encountered resistance. Corporal Davis would remain at the forward operating base to handle any casualties that might be evacuated back to the medical facility. This meant Sarah would be the only medic on the ground during the operation. The responsibility felt enormous, but she tried to project confidence she wasn't entirely sure she possessed. Staff Sergeant Rodriguez, who would serve as her squad leader during the mission, pulled her aside after the briefing. "Martinez, I want you to understand something. This target is important enough that the enemy will fight hard to protect it. They know we're coming and they're prepared for us. Your job is to keep my soldiers alive, no matter what happens out there." Sarah spent the remaining hours before departure checking and rechecking her medical supplies. She carried enough bandages, morphine, and emergency medications to treat multiple severe casualties, but the weight of the equipment meant she would have limited ammunition and water. Every item in her kit represented a calculated risk between medical capability and personal survival. The helicopter insertion went smoothly, with 3 aircraft delivering Alpha Company to a landing zone approximately 2 kilometers from the target compound. Sarah felt her heart rate increase as they approached the ground, but her hands remained steady as she checked her weapon and medical kit one final time. The desert landscape looked different at dawn than it had during her previous patrols. Shadows from rocks and low hills created pockets of concealment that could hide enemy fighters, while the rising sun would soon eliminate any advantage darkness might have provided. The air was still cool, but Sarah could already feel the heat building toward another scorching day. 2nd Squad moved in formation toward the compound, with Sarah positioned in the middle of the group, where she could respond quickly to casualties while remaining protected by the soldiers around her. The unit moved with practiced efficiency, communicating through hand signals and maintaining spacing that balanced security with rapid movement. Through her binoculars, Sarah could see the target compound emerging from the morning haze. It was larger than she had expected, with multiple buildings surrounded by walls that would provide excellent defensive positions for anyone inside. Several vehicles were parked outside the main structure, suggesting the presence of multiple enemy fighters. Lieutenant Patterson's voice crackled through her radio headset. "All units, we have movement in the compound. Multiple military-age males with weapons. This is not a civilian target. Prepare for contact." Sarah felt her mouth go dry as the reality of the situation became clear. This would not be a simple clearing operation. The intelligence had been accurate, and they were approaching a fortified position defended by unknown numbers of hostile forces who had no intention of surrendering. The first shots came from the compound's eastern wall, muzzle flashes bright in the early morning light. Sarah heard the distinctive crack of bullets passing close overhead, followed immediately by the heavier reports of her unit returning fire. She instinctively dropped to a prone position behind a large rock, her medical kit pressed against her body for protection. "Contact front." "Contact front?" Rodriguez's voice shouted over the radio. "All units, we are taking effective fire from multiple positions. Martinez, stay down and be ready to move." The firefight intensified rapidly as both sides sought advantage through superior firepower and positioning. Sarah could hear different types of weapons firing from the compound: automatic rifles, machine guns, and what sounded like rocket-propelled grenades. The enemy was well armed and determined to hold their position. From her concealed position, Sarah watched her unit's tactical movement as they attempted to flank the compound while maintaining suppressive fire. The soldiers moved with professional competence, but she could see that they were facing a larger and better prepared enemy force than intelligence had indicated. Then she heard the sound that would haunt her dreams for years afterward: a soldier screaming for a medic. The call came from First Squad's position, approximately 50 meters to her left, where they had attempted to approach the compound's northern wall. "Medic, medic, we need help over here." Sarah looked toward Rodriguez, who was firing rapidly at targets in the compound while simultaneously trying to coordinate his squad's movements. He caught her eye and nodded grimly. "Go, Martinez. Do your job." Sarah gathered her medical kit and began moving toward First Squad's position. The distance seemed enormous as bullets cracked past her, but she focused on covering the ground quickly while remaining as low as possible. Her training had prepared her for this moment, but the reality of running toward gunfire while carrying life-saving equipment felt surreal. She reached First Squad's position to find Specialist Cooper lying behind a low wall, his left leg twisted at an unnatural angle. Blood was seeping through his uniform trouser and his face was pale with shock. Private Williams was applying pressure to the wound while returning fire at the compound with his free hand. "Cooper took shrapnel from a grenade," Williams shouted over the noise of the firefight. "I think his leg is broken bad and he's losing a lot of blood." Sarah immediately began her assessment, checking Cooper's airway and breathing before examining his wounded leg. The injury was severe. Shrapnel had torn through muscle and possibly fractured the bone, but it was not immediately life-threatening if she could control the bleeding and prevent shock. Working under fire required a different kind of concentration than anything she had experienced during training. She had to block out the sound of bullets impacting around their position while performing precise medical procedures that demanded complete attention to detail. Her hands moved automatically through the steps she had practiced hundreds of times, but now every movement carried the weight of a real human life. As she worked to stabilize Cooper's leg and establish fore access, the tactical situation around them continued to deteriorate. Enemy fire was increasing, and she could hear Lieutenant Patterson calling for artillery support over the radio. The compound's defenders were not only holding their position, but actively maneuvering to gain advantage over the attacking force. "Martinez, we need to move Cooper back to a more secure position," Rodriguez's voice came through her headset. "Can you get him ready for movement?" Sarah looked at Cooper's condition and made a rapid assessment. He was stabilized enough for short-distance movement, but his injury would require surgical intervention that could only be provided back at the base medical facility. She administered pain medication and secured his leg splint for transport. Just as she finished preparing Cooper for evacuation, a new crisis emerged. Staff Sergeant Thompson from 3rd Squad was calling for medical assistance with what sounded like multiple casualties. Sarah felt her heart rate spike as she realized she would need to divide her attention between multiple patients while the firefight continued around them. The next few hours would test every skill she had learned during training and push her beyond limits she hadn't known existed. Sarah was about to discover that being a combat medic meant more than treating injuries. It meant making impossible decisions about life and death while functioning effectively under the most extreme pressure imaginable. As she prepared to move toward 3rd Squad's position, Sarah caught sight of the compound's defenders repositioning their weapons. She realized with growing alarm that Alpha Company was not just engaged in a firefight. They were walking into a carefully prepared ambush that threatened to overwhelm their entire unit. The real battle was just beginning, and Sarah Martinez was about to face the defining moment of her life as a combat medic. Everything she thought she knew about courage, sacrifice, and saving lives was about to be tested in ways that would either forge her into a legend or destroy her completely. The radio crackled with desperate voices as more casualties mounted, and Sarah understood with crystal clarity that the next few hours would determine not only her own fate, but the survival of every soldier depending on her skills to keep them alive long enough to see home again. Sarah's world had narrowed to a series of desperate sprints between wounded soldiers while bullets whistled overhead and explosions shook the ground beneath her feet. The ambush that Alpha Company had walked into was more sophisticated than anyone had anticipated, with enemy fighters positioned in multiple buildings and coordinating their fire to create overlapping fields of death. After stabilizing Specialist Cooper, she had moved to 3rd Squad's position where Staff Sergeant Thompson was directing the evacuation of 2 more casualties. Private Martinez, they shared the same last name, which created confusion on the radio, had taken a bullet through his shoulder that had nicked an artery. Sergeant Kim was unconscious from a head injury, caused by debris from a rocket-propelled grenade that had detonated near his position. Sarah worked frantically to control Martinez's arterial bleeding while simultaneously checking Kim's neurological responses. The shoulder wound was pumping blood at a rate that would prove fatal within minutes if she couldn't get pressure on the damaged vessel. Kim's pupils were unequal and reactive, suggesting a serious brain injury that could worsen rapidly without proper medical intervention. "I need help moving these casualties to a better position," Sarah shouted to Thompson over the noise of the firefight. "Kim needs immediate evacuation, and Martinez won't survive without surgery." Thompson looked around their position grimly. Enemy fire was so intense that any movement in the open would be suicide. The compound's defenders had positioned machine guns to cover all likely evacuation routes, effectively trapping Alpha Company in scattered positions with limited ability to maneuver or retreat. "Martinez," Thompson said, using her rank to distinguish her from the wounded private, "we're pinned down hard. The helicopters can't get close enough for evacuation until we suppress those machine gun positions. Can you keep these men alive until we can break contact?" Sarah assessed her patients quickly. Private Martinez's bleeding was controlled for now, but he would need blood replacement soon. Kim was stable but unconscious, requiring constant monitoring for signs of increased intracranial pressure. Cooper, still at 1st Squad's position, was in shock and needed fluid resuscitation. She was managing 3 critical casualties simultaneously, while enemy fighters continued to pour effective fire into Alpha Company's positions. Her medical supplies were running low, and she had no idea when or if helicopter evacuation would be possible. "I can keep them stable for maybe 2 hours," she told Thompson. "After that, they'll need surgical intervention that I can't provide in the field." As if responding to her words, the radio crackled with Lieutenant Patterson's voice. "All units, be advised that helicopter evacuation is not possible at this time. Enemy forces have moved anti-aircraft weapons into the area. We are effectively cut off until artillery can neutralize the threats." Sarah felt a cold knot form in her stomach. She was responsible for keeping multiple critically wounded soldiers alive, with limited supplies, while trapped in a combat zone with no possibility of evacuation. The situation was rapidly becoming untenable. Then the tactical picture changed again. Staff Sergeant Rodriguez's voice came through the radio with urgent intensity. "All units, we have enemy movement on our flanks. They're trying to surround our position. We need to consolidate and prepare for close combat." Sarah realized with horror that the ambush was entering its final phase. The enemy had successfully trapped Alpha Company in a kill zone and was now moving to eliminate them completely. Her wounded soldiers would not survive a hand-to-hand combat situation. "Thompson, I need to move my casualties to a more defensible position," she said. "If they overrun our current positions, everyone dies." Thompson nodded and called for volunteers to help move the wounded. Despite the intense enemy fire, 4 soldiers immediately volunteered to expose themselves to help with casualty evacuation. Sarah was struck by the selfless courage of men who were willing to risk their own lives to save their wounded comrades. The movement to a more defensible position required crossing 30 meters of open ground, while under direct observation by enemy fighters. Sarah and her volunteer assistants would have to carry 3 casualties while enemy snipers attempted to kill them. The mathematical odds of success seemed impossibly low. But Sarah had learned something during her months in Afghanistan that no training exercise had taught her. In combat, impossible odds became irrelevant when people's lives depended on action rather than hesitation. She had evolved from the uncertain recruit who had frozen during training scenarios into a combat veteran capable of functioning effectively under the most extreme circumstances. "On my mark, we move fast and low," she told her volunteers. "I'll take Kim because of his head injury. Williams, you and Jackson get Martinez. Cooper can walk with assistance if we support his weight." The movement began with a devastating barrage of covering fire from the rest of Alpha Company. Every soldier who could still fight poured suppressive fire into the compound, forcing the enemy to seek cover while the evacuation team exposed themselves in the open. Sarah had never run so fast while carrying another human being. Kim's dead weight made balance difficult, but adrenaline gave her strength she didn't know she possessed. Bullets cracked past her head and kicked up dust at her feet, but she focused entirely on reaching the defensive position without falling or dropping her patient. They made it to cover just as enemy fire intensified again. Sarah immediately resumed medical care for her patients, checking vital signs and adjusting treatments while the firefight continued around them. Her new position was more defensible but also more crowded, with wounded and unwounded soldiers pressed together behind inadequate cover. Private Martinez was showing signs of going into shock despite her efforts to maintain his blood pressure. Kim remained unconscious with neurological signs that suggested his brain injury was worsening. Cooper was stable but in significant pain that her limited morphine supply couldn't adequately control. Sarah realized she needed to make a decision that would have been unthinkable just months earlier. With limited medical supplies and no possibility of evacuation, she would have to prioritize which patients received her remaining medications and equipment. It was a form of battlefield triage that medical training had covered in theory, but that felt completely different when applied to actual people she knew. "Rodriguez," she called to her squad leader, "I need to know honestly, what are our chances of breaking contact and getting out of here?" Rodriguez looked at her with the tired eyes of a professional soldier who had been in too many similar situations. "Martinez, we're in a fight for our lives. The enemy has us outnumbered and outgunned. We might get out of this, but it's going to take everything we have." Sarah nodded and made her decision. She would use her remaining supplies to give all 3 patients the best possible chance of survival, even if it meant she would have nothing left for future casualties. It was a calculated risk based on the assumption that either they would all survive the current situation, or her remaining supplies wouldn't matter anyway. As she administered her last bag of 4 fluid to Private Martinez, the radio brought news that changed everything. Artillery fire missions were finally approved, and helicopter gunships were en route to provide close air support. Alpha Company's situation was about to improve dramatically, but Sarah knew the next few minutes would be the most dangerous yet. Enemy fighters would make their final assault before air support arrived, and her wounded soldiers would be caught in the middle of a close quarters battle that would test every assumption about survival in combat. Sarah checked her personal weapon and prepared for the possibility that she might have to choose between her role as a healer and her duty as a soldier. The sound of approaching helicopters mixed with increasing enemy gunfire as both sides prepared for the climactic phase of a battle that would either end in rescue or complete disaster. Sarah Martinez was about to discover that her greatest challenges as a combat medic were still ahead, and that true courage sometimes meant accepting that saving some lives might require risking everything. The first Apache helicopter appeared like an avenging angel against the morning sky, its distinctive silhouette cutting through the heat shimmer as it approached the compound at attack speed. Sarah heard the deep whop-whop of its rotors, mixing with the sharp crack of its 30mm cannon as it began engaging the enemy positions that had kept Alpha Company pinned down for nearly 4 hours. But the arrival of air support also triggered the enemy's final desperate assault. Sarah watched through a gap in their defensive position as dozens of fighters emerged from concealed positions around the compound. their assault rifles chattering as they charged across the open ground toward Alpha Company's scattered positions. "They're making their run?" Rodriguez shouted into his radio. "All units, prepare for close combat." Sarah found herself in an impossible situation. Her 3 wounded soldiers needed constant medical attention, but the approaching enemy fighters meant she would soon be fighting for her life, with a rifle instead of saving lives with medical equipment. Everything she had trained for was colliding into a single moment that would define not only her own survival, but the fate of everyone depending on her. Private Martinez was slipping deeper into shock despite her efforts to maintain his blood pressure. Kim remained unconscious with brain injury symptoms that suggested he needed immediate surgery. Cooper was alert but weakening from blood loss and pain that her depleted morphine supply could no longer adequately control. The tactical situation was deteriorating rapidly as enemy fighters closed the distance to Alpha Company's positions. Sarah could see muzzle flashes getting closer, hear the impact of bullets striking the rocks and debris that provided their only protection. In minutes, maybe less, the fighting would become hand-to-hand and wounded soldiers would be completely helpless. That was when Sarah Martinez made the decision that would transform her from an ordinary combat medic into a legend whispered about in military hospitals and training facilities for years to come. Instead of preparing her rifle for the approaching assault, she grabbed her medical kit and began moving between wounded soldiers under heavy enemy fire. "Martinez, what are you doing?" Thompson shouted. "Get down and prepare to fight. My job is keeping these men alive." Sarah shouted back, continuing to work on Private Martinez's IV line while bullets cracked overhead. "If I stop treating them to fight, they die anyway." What happened next would be debated and analyzed in military academies. But the soldiers who witnessed it would never forget the sight of a 22-year-old medic calmly performing medical procedures while enemy fighters advanced within grenade range of her position. Sarah had entered what combat veterans sometimes call the zone, a state of focused concentration where training becomes instinct and fear transforms into clarity of purpose. She moved from patient to patient, adjusting medications, checking vital signs, and maintaining treatments while the battle raged around her. When shrapnel from an enemy grenade wounded Specialist Johnson in her leg, Sarah crawled across open ground under machine gun fire to provide medical treatment. When Sergeant Williams took a bullet through his arm while defending their position, she bandaged his wound while he continued firing his rifle with his good hand. The Apache helicopters had engaged multiple enemy positions around the compound, but the fighters who had already closed to within assault range continued their attack. Sarah could see their faces now, determined men with automatic weapons who intended to kill everyone in Alpha Company's defensive perimeter. Staff Sergeant Rodriguez later said that watching Sarah work under fire was like seeing someone who had transcended normal human limitations. She anticipated medical needs before they became critical, moved between casualties with economy of motion that seemed choreographed, and maintained calm professionalism while bullets shredded the air around her. But Sarah's most extraordinary moment came when enemy fighters broke through Alpha Company's defensive line and entered their position. A Taliban fighter armed with an AK-47 emerged from behind a rock formation less than 20 feet from where she was treating Private Martinez. The enemy fighter raised his rifle toward the wounded American soldiers, his finger moving toward the trigger. Sarah looked up from her patient, saw death approaching, and made a choice that surprised even her. Instead of reaching for her own weapon, she placed her body between the gunmen and her wounded soldiers. "No," she said quietly, her voice somehow audible despite the chaos around them. What followed lasted only seconds but seemed to stretch into eternity. The Taliban fighter stared at the young American woman who had chosen to shield wounded enemies with her own body rather than reach for a weapon. For a moment that defied the logic of combat, two human beings looked at each other across a divide of war and politics and saw something that transcended their roles as combatants. The hesitation cost the fighter his life as Staff Sergeant Rodriguez shot him from a flanking position. But Sarah's action had saved her patients from certain death, while demonstrating a form of courage that went beyond anything taught in military training. The battle's climax came minutes later as artillery fire called in by Lieutenant Patterson devastated the remaining enemy positions around the compound. The combination of accurate artillery and helicopter gunship attacks finally broke the ambush that had trapped Alpha Company for most of the day. As the firing diminished and then stopped entirely, Sarah continued working on her patients with the same focused intensity she had maintained throughout the battle. Her hands moved automatically through medical procedures while her mind processed the enormity of what they had all survived. Medical evacuation helicopters arrived within 30 minutes of the cessation of hostile fire. Sarah supervised the loading of her patients while providing detailed medical briefings to the flight medics, who would continue their care during transport to the military hospital. All three of her critical patients survived their injuries. Private Martinez required emergency surgery but made a full recovery. Kim's brain injury healed completely with no lasting effects. Cooper walked with a slight limp but returned to active duty 6 months later. The story of Sarah's actions under fire spread through the military medical community and beyond. She received the Silver Star for gallantry in action, becoming one of the youngest female medics ever to receive such recognition. But more important to her than any medal was the knowledge that 12 soldiers from Alpha Company had returned home alive because she had done her job under impossible circumstances. Years later, after completing her military service and becoming a civilian nurse practitioner in Phoenix, Sarah would sometimes visit her old elementary school to speak to students about service and courage. She would tell them that heroes weren't people who felt no fear, but people who chose to act despite their fear when others needed help. Her grandmother Rosa, now in her 90s but still sharp, kept newspaper clippings about Sarah's military service in a scrapbook that she showed to anyone willing to listen. "I always knew she had healing hands," Rosa would say, "but I never knew how brave her heart was until she went to war." Sarah never considered herself a hero. She had simply done what she was trained to do under circumstances that demanded everything she could give. But in choosing to prioritize saving lives over preserving her own safety, she had demonstrated the highest ideals of military medicine and earned a place in the long tradition of medics who serve as guardian angels on battlefields around the world. The young woman who had once worried about affording college had discovered that true wealth came not from money or recognition, but from the knowledge that her skills and courage had made a difference when it mattered most. She had gone to war as Sarah Martinez from Phoenix, Arizona. She came home as Doc Martinez, a legend whose story would inspire future generations of medics to understand that healing hands could be as powerful as any weapon ever forged. In the end, Sarah's story was not just about one person's courage under fire. It was about the extraordinary things that ordinary people can accomplish when they choose service over self-interest, when they decide that other people's lives matter more than their own comfort or safety. It was a story that proved that heroes aren't born, they're made in moments when the choice between right and easy reveals who we really are. And Sarah Martinez, the rookie medic who had once frozen during training exercises, had chosen to become someone worthy of the trust that wounded soldiers placed in her hands when they called for help in their darkest moments. In doing so, she had transformed not only their lives, but her own understanding of what it truly meant to serve others with honor, courage, and an unshakable commitment to preserving life in the face of death itself.